Hello, everyone. My name is Harry Campbell, and we welcome you to Trekking to the Polls, our webinar in hopes of preparing you to go out to vote on Tuesday, November 8th. Before we jump into everything that we need to talk to you about today and hope to convey in order to prepare your trek to the polls, we need to make sure that we cover the fact that under our Internal Revenue Code, all Section 501c3, and that includes the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, are prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elected public office. This webinar is really intended to help prepare you to understand what you need to be thinking about, hopefully considering, and weighing your options in order to prepare for a successful voting experience on Tuesday, November 8th. Joining us this evening will be Carla Essing, who is our grassroots manager in the Pennsylvania office of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. She's making sure that things are operating smoothly. We also have with us our staff attorney, Tricia Salvia. And then last, and some would say least, we have me as well. Harry Campbell, I'm the Director of Science Policy and Advocacy in the Pennsylvania office of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. If you're not familiar with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, I'll give you a little bit of a background. We were formed in 1967. We're the largest organization representing the effort to quote unquote save the Bay. And we've done a lot of things with our over 200 and some odd thousand members, plus nearly just over 200 staff representing in places of 6 offices and 15 education centers that are scattered across the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, which covers 64,000 square miles of size, and including the state of Pennsylvania. And in fact, the Pennsylvania office of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation was established in the mid-1980s. So we've been around for quite some time, and our efforts are largely focused on 4 main things. First and foremost, we have a nationally award-winning education program that takes out thousands of kids in normal years and on experiential-based watershed learning efforts. So they go out there and canoe and really study the science in the water to understand what's happening and why in those areas. We have a nationally award-winning restoration program as well, established in 1997, that has worked with thousands of farmers and other landowners across the watershed of Pennsylvania, installing practices primarily such as forested riparian buffers, but other best management practices that reduce pollution coming off of the land, particularly sediments and nutrients coming off of the land and instead of going into the water. We have a policy shop, that's where Tricia and I work, that deals a lot with our state agencies as well as our state legislature, and the things and activities that they actually do over the course of their legislative sessions. And then, of course, last but not least, we undertake litigation. When there are no other options to restore or protect our rivers and streams, we undertake litigation actions through the courts in order to enforce our clean water laws, both at a state and federal level. We also administer the Keystone 10 Million Trees Partnership. And as what we like to say, clean water grows on trees. And therefore, this effort is actually to plant 10 million trees, oh boy, across the landscape of Pennsylvania, primarily focused on streams, streets, and other high priority areas. Why did I stumble and almost say 5? That's because we reached that 5 million milestone just the other week. Earlier last week, we actually had a big event where we hit the 5,000 tree milestone. And so we're halfway there in our Keystone 10 Million Trees Partnership. But this evening, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about preparing you to go to the polls. And our objectives this evening are, 1, to really kind of drive home that your vote matters in the ways that affect your health, quality of life, and well-being. And therefore, to help plan your trek as you start to think about whom you may be going and where you're going on November 8th to cast your vote. And then, of course, we want you to vote. Hopefully, our conversation this evening will really catalyze your interest in voting in our upcoming election. And then not only to do it this time around, but to do it again next time as well. But it can be pretty daunting. For some, preparing to vote is actually so daunting that they don't. And as a result, that means your voice is lost. Your voice, which is so critical to determining our government and what their priorities are, is lost, like being lost in the wilderness. But with any good trek, preparing for any hike or any good trek, you need to plan. That means mapping out what you're going to need, where you're going, and what you're going to do when you get there. And that's what our goal is here today, to help you prepare for that trek to the polls on November 8th. So I'd like to hand it off right now to Trisha Salvia to jump into some of the nuances of our governmental structure that helps you understand who you're voting for and why. Trish, take it away.
Thanks, Harry, and thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk today about some of my favorite things, which is government. So this is going to be a little bit of a refresher, but I think it's really, really important in preparing for that trek to understand, the whole government function and structure and how these elections at every single level really, really matter and what they mean to you. I think sometimes it gets lost in your day-to-day. People hear about politics and government generally, but what does that do to you? How does that impact you daily? Whether that impacts, driving to your schools or going to work or what you do, government plays a role, and then how you vote for them is really critical. So let's start at the big mountain. Let's start our journey. So the bottom is local government. So these are the different levels of government, and local government really is the base of a mountain. It's large and it's important, and it holds the rest of the structures up. There's state government, and there's of course federal government. I'm going to talk mainly about local and state, mainly because the federal government mirrors a lot of the state structure. So to kind of talk about it both would just be kind of repetitive, and I don't know if you want to hear all that. So let's get that going. So starting again, like I said, at the local level, Pennsylvania has a lot of local government. This is a big map of Pennsylvania with lots of little fractures and little lines throughout it, because our local government in Pennsylvania is everywhere, and it makes up all of Pennsylvania. It is the base of the mountain. It is large, but every local government is small too. It's very accessible. You can reach the bottom of a mountain pretty easily, just like you can reach probably your local officials and local level readily and easily as well. So how big is it? Let's look. There are 67 counties in Pennsylvania, 56 cities, 959 bureaus, and over 1,500 townships. And every single one of these levels, the counties, the cities, the boroughs, the townships, wherever you live, have local elected officials. And they do a lot of the local stuff in your, your neighborhoods down the street from you. So if you're interested in public safety or police policies in your township, then you'll probably want to pay attention to your county sheriff and your district attorneys when you're looking at your elections. If you're concerned about that big pothole on the main road in your township or city, well, again, you want to be able to get to your city officials or your township or borough, county and township supervisors and elected officials. They are the ones that will, be working to help you get a pothole fixed or help you have more safety in your neighborhood. But also they deal a lot with the land use and zoning. So if there is overdevelopment in your city or your township and you don't like all that development, well, it's your township supervisors, it's your county commissioners, elected officials that are overseeing that and voting on those issues. So you want to make sure you have people in those positions that you are happy with and represent what you want done in your local government. And finally, there's the school districts. If you want more say in your school's curriculums or the school budget, or even the transportation, is there enough buses to get your kids or children to the public schools? You can vote on your school board. Those are people that you vote for in elections. In Pennsylvania, we have 501 school districts, which is an awful lot. But again, you can have a say in how the school boards are elected when you vote. So let's move on to the state level. Like I said, the state and federal really mirror each other. They both have these big three branches of government. There's the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch is making the laws, the executive branch is executing those laws, and the judicial branch is interpreting and making sure those laws are not being violated. So now we're kind of moving up that trek and moving up that mountain and seeing where more elected officials play a role in the state level branches of government. So let's start with the legislative branch. The Pennsylvania General Assembly is made up of two chambers. There's the Senate and the House of Representatives. Our Senate has 28 Republicans right now, 21 Democrats, and 1 independent. There are 50 in total. The House of Representatives has 203 members. There's 113 Republicans, 88 Democrats, and 2 vacancies at the moment. The Senate, they have 4-year elected terms. These are all elected officials in the Senate and House of Representatives. These are people that you will possibly see on your ballot this year. Like I said, the Senate has 4-year terms. They stagger them every 2 years. So half the Senate's up for election and then the other half will be up. For the House of Representatives, their terms are 2 years. So they come up for re-election every 2 years. There are no term limits in Pennsylvania for the Senate or the House, so they can keep being reelected if they choose to run again. Pennsylvania, fun fact, has one of the largest state legislatures in the United States and also one of the highest paid state legislatures in the United States. These legislators are the ones that are drafting and writing and trying to pass bills at the state level. The bills then can become law depending if the governor signs the bill once it reaches his desk or vetoes it. So there's a lot of checks and balances that I'm going to kind of keep talking about because I think it's important to see how your elected officials also kind of balance each other's powers throughout the process. So some bills can be good, some bills can be bad. You want officials and elected people that represent your district that you think best reflects what you want them to be working on for your communities. Also, this legislature, along with their bills, that's a tongue twister. They work on the state budget as well. So the state budget, although the state legislature has 2-year legislative sessions, they do the budget every single year. So they work and draft the state budget. So good, bad, or in between, they're the ones kind of working on that budget. And again, it takes the governor's approval or veto to get that budget passed timely each year. So I'm going to move to the executive branch. The executive branch, these are the agencies and governor that they execute the laws. So elected officials, of course, is the governor and lieutenant governor. In Pennsylvania, they run on separate ballots. A lot of states, the governor and lieutenant governor are on the same ballot together. Ours is separate in Pennsylvania. This is a big year in Pennsylvania because it's time for a new governor. Governors run every 4 years in Pennsylvania, and they have a 2-term limit. So that means they can only run for or be governor for a total of 8 years if they get reelected. So under the governor, after he or she is voted in, they then have the power to appoint the head of state agencies and also appoint board and commission members. I'm going to talk about those in a second, but before that, there's also in the executive branch what we call offices. They're independent of the governor, and they are also elected officials. So some examples of that is the attorney general, the auditor general, the state treasurer. These are all offices that are under the executive branch that run independent of the governor, and they are not part of his appointments under the agencies. Some boards and commissions that you may be familiar with is your liquor control board. So if you don't like a wine or you want a wine in your liquor store, then maybe you should, make sure you pick the right elected official for that. Or the Public Utility Commission. If you're not happy with your electric rates, or if you're wanting more renewable energy in the state of Pennsylvania, they can help with that. And then there's the Turnpike Commission. I know my drives to Pittsburgh are getting expensive on the Turnpike. So again, these are all important positions that play a role in who you're thinking of when you're electing your governor or other offices. Under the agencies, lots of different agencies, whether it's Department of Health, which we've been hearing a lot of recently during these COVID years, the Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education. These are all examples of agencies that are under the executive branch. They help write the regulations and execute the laws that the legislature authorized them to do. So it takes an act of the legislative branch to give authority to the executive branch to make these regulations. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of checks and balances in the legislature and with the governor. So when the legislators pass the bill, it has to come to the governor's desk. And when it comes to the governor's desk, he could either veto it or pass it. Some good examples that I love to share of good bills that have gone through. One is our Hellbender. He is our state amphibian. And Governor Wolf signed this into law just recently. Pennsylvania didn't have a state amphibian until just recently. Student leaders, a bunch of high school students got together and said, hey, let's look at the Hellbender. They're an indicator of good, clean water. And the legislature took it up and they're like, that's a great idea. Let's make that our state amphibian. Governor Wolf loved it, signed it into law, and now we have a state amphibian. The other one is when you registered your car, or re-register your car, or renew your driver's license online. You may have had that opportunity recently to donate a couple dollars to what is called the Keystone Tree Fund. The Keystone Tree Fund donates, gives that donated money to plant trees in rural and urban and riparian areas. These are all recent laws that have been passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. So some good examples. There's always bad examples too, but I want to stay with the positives. Moving on to our last branch of government, it's the judicial branch. And again, hopefully you didn't have too much experience with any of these, but they do play an important role in all of this. They are the ones that are interpreting the laws that the legislators write, or the regulations that are drafted by the executive branch. And if there's a violation of a state constitution, then the Supreme Court will hear those cases and determine whether something needs to be done about that. But again, in Pennsylvania, we are very fortunate in that these are all elected positions. All judges in Pennsylvania are elected by the citizens of Pennsylvania. Most of the courts, the Supreme Court, Commonwealth Court, Superior Court, and Court of Common Pleas, they all have 10-year terms, and judges don't have term limits. They can continue to be reelected as a judge so long as the people vote for them until they reach, I think, the age of 75. The lower courts, the magisterial district courts, and the municipal courts have 6-year terms. So the bottom level, you're like, oh, well, what's that do? Why do I care what judge is in place? Well, it's important because whether you get a speeding ticket or family court issues, if you want to get married, the courts oversee that. If you want a divorce, the courts can help you with that as well. If you get into a car accident, a lot of those cases are heard at what are down at the green level, the trial courts. You will go see them first, and those judges will hear your case and help you through that process. And if you're unhappy with those decisions, or you want a second opinion, then you can go to the appellate level. That's your Commonwealth and Superior Courts. The Commonwealth Court mainly hears a lot of different executive agency type of cases. So if somebody wanted a permit from DEP and they didn't like it, then they go to Commonwealth Court to see if the law was applied appropriately. And then, of course, the state Supreme Court, they oversee a lot of the constitutional type of issues in Pennsylvania. So these are all really important in your day-to-day. Judges play a vital role in kind of keeping that balance with the executive and the legislative branch, as well as making sure those laws are being followed appropriately. So as a refresher, I kind of like going through what I call the hierarchy of laws, but it's a really kind of a nice way to kind of see where all the different balance of powers play a role in how all these elected officials kind of work together in a way. So starting with the state constitution. The state constitution is really cool in that if there's ever an amendment, if anybody wants to amend the state constitution, you as a voter get to ultimately decide upon that. So what has to happen is that the amendment has to go through our legislature, but not just once. It has to go through twice. It has to go through 2 consecutive legislative sessions in order for it to then get onto the election ballot, where you as a citizen gets to decide yes or no to an amendment to our Constitution. A really great example that I love to talk about is our Environmental Rights Amendment. This was passed in 1971. 3/4 of the citizens voted in favor of it when it was on the ballot. And it gives a fundamental right to the citizens of Pennsylvania to have clean air and pure water and access to natural resources. Pennsylvania is one of the few states that actually has a constitutional amendment in favor of environmental rights. So we're very fortunate there. So laws, the next block down, again, this is your state legislators. Those elected officials are writing and designing the laws, and then going up to the governor, who's in the executive branch, to veto or sign off on it. And then the regulations, these are done by the executive branch agencies, but they have to have the authority from the legislatures first in order to draft those regulations. And then policies, guidances, et cetera, those are more of the executive agencies kind of writing those. But ultimately, then the judicial branch plays a role by overseeing all of these laws, and especially the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court looks over any constitutional violations. So I think, and I hope I have prepared you for some of your journey. You're kind of getting a feel for your trek through the wilderness or the mountain. You're doing your research. You now know all of these things in your day-to-day in government impacts you, and that you get to have a voice in electing all of these different officials that play a role in that. What if you still have some questions? Well, there's a lot of really great resources out there for you. One of them is who will be on my election ballot. This is a really cool website if you get the chance to go on it. This 411.org, you just type in your address and it'll tell you exactly who's going to be on your election ballot. And then you could take additional steps and research them, find out, if they represent what you want for your community, for your state, and so on and so forth. If you're just curious about who your state and federal legislators are currently, there's a CBF has a nice little action center where you can click on that link. Same thing, just put in your address. It'll give you all the information you need. And then finally, if you have questions about, information on your local election officials, if you have questions about polling and other things, this is a good resource for that. So with that, I will turn it back to Harry so he can talk more about your journey and your trek to the ballots.
Well, thank you, Trish. That was a very exhaustive and hopefully informative piece of information about the form and function, if you will, of our state governmental system and how ultimately they all come together in a way in which it really does affect our health, our well-being, and our quality of life as Pennsylvanians. when you really sit back and think about it, those folks that we are electing to offices at the local all the way to the federal level are doing things on a daily basis that have an indirect or direct impact on our health, well-being, and quality of life as Pennsylvanians, but also as citizens of the United States. And so that's why it's one of the reasons why it's so critically important to really think about and understand what are the types of folks we like to have representing us in these varying bodies. But it goes even beyond that. And it goes down to things like state parks and forests. Are they being preserved, restored, or protected? Are they being created in order to be available, accessible to all of Pennsylvanians? And even education, as Trish mentioned earlier, with our 501 school districts, or library services, public works, even our emergency services, our protection services. These are things that are affected directly and oftentimes also indirectly by whom we elect to our local, state, and even federal agencies and legislatures. So it's critically important that you make your voice heard in an informed way, because those things are going to be impacting not only you, your neighbors, but also those of your children and grandchildren. And finally, it's your right. You have the constitutional right to be a voter in the United States and certainly in Pennsylvania. And so exercising that right is a responsibility, we believe, as a citizen of this country. Now, there's important things to recognize that when you're getting ready to prepare to vote, and one is dates. There are deadlines associated with that. In fact, one just passed yesterday, and that was the voter registration deadline. So if you're watching this and you're actually not registered to vote, well, I have some bad news for you. However, you can remember that for next time, that you can register at any point in time, but you won't be able to vote this time. But when you register to vote, you'll be able to then vote for the next series of elections, which will be a presidential election year. So I'm sure that'll be fun and exciting, if anything, if a repeat of last time has anything to say about it. But nonetheless, November 1st, if you are doing an absentee ballot, you got to get that in there. It's got to be received by November 1st, not just postmarked, but received by the county election board by November 1st. So if you are voting by mail, get that in ASAP as soon as you have enough information to say, I'm an informed voter. And then if you're planning to actually vote in person, which many of us are as well, you'll have until 8 p.m. on Tuesday, November 8th to do that. So you really need to think about, well, what is my day going to look like so that it isn't 7:55 and you're like, oh dear, I forgot to vote. So that's part of that preparation. And just like preparing for a journey on a trek or a hike, you got to make that checklist. You got to map out where you want to go. And some of the things you really need to start to think about, if you aren't already aware, is like things like, where's my polling place? Am I registered? Have I studied the ballot, as Trish mentioned earlier, like with that Vote 411? Or even as simple as, how am I going to get there? I know where it is, but I'm not sure how I'm going to get there. And considering what kind of ID I may need to have, and what happens if I need help. These are some of the things to check off in your mental list, or even make a physical one before you trek out onto your great adventure of voting on November 8th. So one of the things to do ahead of time, if you don't know where your polling place is, well, Pennsylvania has a handy dandy little website for that, pavoterservices.pa.gov. You'll see a thing, you see that yellow swipe right there. Find your polling place, put in your information, and you'll be able to identify exactly where your district is and the closest polling place is for you. That's your place. As long as you live in that place, or they don't move that polling place, that's going to be your place where you'll be doing voting. You also want to make sure, if you haven't done that already, is the same website, check your voting registration status. Are you signed up to be a voter in Pennsylvania? Have you registered to be a voter? And that's therefore, does that district or that polling place have your information already on file? And that makes, if it is, that makes things a lot easier than if you just kind of walked in there off the street in a random way, which I don't advise you doing. You got to do your homework. You got to understand what I need to do before I go, and what I need and where to go, and what I may need to bring along with me. but also studying that ballot. Trish mentioned earlier about that vote411.org, and you type in information and you have a ballot pop up. There's also other resources like this ballotpedia.org that'll actually give you a sample ballot based on your location as well. And then you'll be able to familiarize yourself not only with the names that are on that list, but what they will look like. It actually replicates what the ballot will physically look like if you're standing there at the screen when you're in the polling booth. And for a lot of folks, that can help make things a lot more understandable, accessible, or otherwise less stressful when they get into the polling booth as well. And how to get there. Are you going to walk? I walk. I only walk. It's only about 0.2 of a mile to my nearest polling place. So I'm always trekking right down to the polling place and walking back home. It's a nice little mental break from the day or the evening, depending on when I go and do it. But that's one way you can you can drive yourself, which a number of people do. Most people probably do drive to the polls, or get a ride from a friend, or take public transport. The bottom line, or even ride a bike. I highly encourage riding a bike. But the bottom line is figuring out, how am I going to get there? What if it's raining? What if it's snowing? Probably not so frequently happening these days, but nonetheless, inclement weather, it can affect how you want to get there. So have ideas as a walk, bike, ride, planes, trains, and automobiles, whatever suits you best. And then, of course, depending on if it's the first time that you're voting, especially if it's the first time that you're voting at the polling place that you're going to, you're going to want to bring some ID. There's a whole myriad of things that constitute ID, acceptable ID in the state of Pennsylvania. But if you're a first-time voter or have moved or otherwise are going to that polling place for the very first time, it's always good to have a couple of forms of ID, at least one on hand, so that you just make sure that they have the information that they need to make sure that you are who you say you are, and that ultimately your vote counts. And then if you need any help, you notice that there's some shenanigans going on, something doesn't feel right, you feel that there's some activities happening that on the polling place that should not be happening, there are systems and entities in place to help you in real time address those issues. And one of those is Election Protection Hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE. You can text or call, and they will give you information and guidance directly in real time regarding what you are experiencing in your polling place, and guidance as to what to do next. Now, of course, if it's an emergency situation, we all highly encourage you calling 911 and emergency services. But for things that are associated with non-emergencies and election type of activities, this is a great resource to have. It's across the nation, not just Pennsylvania, but it's something that you can rely upon if you feel the need to. So at the end of the day, with a little planning and preparation, you can have a successful voting day in PA. So let's go get ready to take a trek to the polls. And that concludes our webinar. And on behalf of Tricia, Carla, and I, we thank you for joining this webinar to Trekking to the Polls. We encourage you to take a look at our website and consider joining CBF if you aren't a member, and joining the hundreds of thousands of folks, like-minded individuals who are out there each and every day helping to restore and protect our rivers and streams for the betterment not only of the Chesapeake Bay, but Pennsylvania's waterways, our health and well-being and quality of life as well. Basically, in order to save the Bay, we've got to save PA. And that's our rivers and streams and the communities in our own backyard. So now let's go out and vote on November 8th. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care.